Let's talk about organ meats. Hi, I'm Jen. If you're new here, I am delighted to meet you. I'm a doctor of physical therapy and I've experienced radical healing on a carnivore diet. I would love to help you do the same. Today, I'm joined by Chef James Berry, who's going to talk with us all about organs, why we should eat them, how to get them, how to prepare them, and some other methods for incorporating them that does not include taking capsules if eating the whole food is not exactly an option. This was a really insightful interview. I think you guys are really going to love it. But I do have to give you one warning. As we were filming, a severe thunderstorm rolled in, and I suddenly had hardly any lighting. So that's why about halfway through, I get a little bit gray. I didn't set up any lights because I didn't know to prepare for that. But anywho, this video is as full of information as organ meats are full of nutrients. So I know that's a lame joke, but stick around if you're interested. And at the end, I'm going to deliver a little bit of a challenge that I'd love for you to join me on. So stick around and see what that is. As I said in the introduction, James is here with us to talk all things organ meats. James is a husband, a father, a business owner, a chef, and I would love for you guys to meet him. So James, thank you for joining us and tell us a little bit about yourself and where you came from.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. Geez, so I started out very picky eater. I knew dinner was ready because the smoke detector would go off in our house. That was very much how I grew up. I almost, even though I was born in the 70s, I feel like I grew up like on 50s diet. It was like baked potato, frozen peas, and then shake and bake, whatever, chicken or pork. It was just like shake and bake style. So it just feels like I was a product of my time. We started out eating Wonder Bread, and when, I don't know, US Weekly or whatever the magazine of the time was said, oh, whole wheat is better, suddenly we were eating whole wheat. It was just such a different time then of awareness around nutrition and food and digestion, all of it really. But from that, I grew my passion for cooking. From the age of 7, I was just always just interested in food. And I think later on, I learned that it's kind of my love language. It's like cooking for other people is kind of how I show love and care. And so it wasn't though until I was in my 30s that I took it like as a sign of like, I need to make this my career. Like, this is what I'm here to do. And I went to culinary school in New York, came out, and I was very specific about, I want to cook privately. I don't want to cook in a restaurant. I think even now there's even more awareness that cooking in a restaurant is actually not very healthy. It's like the conditions are really rigorous. I call restaurant chefs kind of like the modern day pirates. They work really long hours. They work very late into the night, and they just kind of have their own thing going on. And a lot of them chain smoke, drink, and just have really, it's hard to be healthy, when you're in that kind of lifestyle. So I just knew I didn't want to do that, and started private chefing. Then I started a meal delivery service, and then I moved from LA because the business was killing me, and I was able to be a stay-at-home dad for a few years with my youngest daughter, and I kind of got my health back because anyone that's listening that's an entrepreneur knows like it's really hard to take care of yourself when you're hoofing it. So I got my health back, and then I came up with this idea of Pluck, which is an organ-based seasoning, and it's, in my judgment, the easiest and most delicious way to get organ meats into your diet. It's just so easy. It's as easy as salt and pepper in your food.
I love that. And we're going to get into the Pluck stuff really deeply, but let's save that for a little bit. First of all, let's just talk about a little bit of background of organ meats. And I know as someone who's big in the carnivore community, what I think of when I think of organ meats is liver. So I know there are many more out there though. So can you kind of define for us what organ meats are and what's out there besides liver?
Absolutely. So another name for organ meats, and there's been many over the years, like around World War II, they called them variety meats. They tried to rebrand organ meats to make them sexy. So over the years, there's always been different names, but the one that most people know is offal, OFFAL, which is a perfect name, right? Since most people think they taste awful. But it refers to that idea of when you're butchering an animal, it's the parts of the animal that fall off as you butcher the animal. So That's where they think the name came from originally, but it's basically referring to every part of the animal except the muscle and the bone. So it does include the bone marrow, just not the actual bone. And so when we think of like when I think of offal, I think of blood. You have, of course, the common ones like liver, kidney, heart, but there's also the less common, the spleen, the lungs, the testicles. There's in some parts of our country, there's actually, they call them Rocky Mountain festivals, Rocky Mountain oyster festivals, and that's testicles. Like, and the way they prepare them is they fry them. And so they look like kind of like crispy balls, really. But that's what they look like. They're coated, breaded, so they don't look like testicles, so they just look like a literal like ball. And so there are parts of our country that are eating offal, but other parts that are considered offal, I mentioned the bone marrow, but also like the tongue, the lips, the ears, the skin and tail. I mean, really, it's every part. The stomach, which is known as tripe. The stomach is fascinating because if you ever go to a Mexican restaurant, so tripe is the stomach, and that's usually, if you go to a Mexican market, you'll see it and it's bright white. And so you'll see it in the store and you go like, oh, is that what cow stomachs look like? It's like, no, they don't. What they do is they actually bleach them to make them look that white. So that's one thing to be aware of, is depending on where you buy your organs, sometimes you're probably not going to want to eat like a bleached organ, right? So you're going to want to soak it, and a lot of times we recommend soaking it in like buttermilk or lemon juice to help kind of pull out any of these impurities from the processing of the organ. But really what a cow stomach looks like is, it looks like whatever they're eating. So it's kind of green. It's covered, like if they've eaten a nail, there's nails in it, it's like, it's just covered in stuff, and it's really challenging to clean it. But that's if you're going to get homesteader style on it, but if you're not, then you got to kind of take what you can find. And the main place to find many organs actually are ethnic markets. So you can find some online, but it's going to be really hard to find, for example, tripe. But you will definitely find it at a Mexican market, because that is a staple of their cuisine. But in general, like, you look at offal and it's all over the US. I mentioned, yeah, they have those festivals, but for the most part, every other country's got it as a staple part of their food. Like I mentioned, Mexico with menudo, that's got the tripe. You have haggis, which is in Scotland. That's like sheep and calf heart. It's mixed with the fat, the suet. It's oatmeal, and it's made in like it's usually boiled in the stomach of the animal, and it's something that people really readily eat there, and then there's like steak and kidney pie in the UK. There's pate in France. There's chitlins, which are in the South. Have you ever had those?
I have never had chitlins, but I have had Rocky Mountain oysters.
You have?
That's a thing in Kansas, yes.
Okay, what did they taste like, and how did you like it, the texture?
Well, I was young, so I don't have a ton of memory about it, but it was a fairly frequent thing. But it was just like a fried ball. So it
Yeah.
seemed like any fried food, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's kind of the default that Americans have, is like, oh, don't know what to do with it, let's just fry it. And then it's, you know, then it's as unhealthy as you can get, but then it's also like just kind of got a generic kind of like texture, crunchy texture, which most people gravitate towards.
Yeah. Now, what are chitlins?
Chitlins are the intestines, so it's pig intestine.
Oh.
Which is interesting, because back in the day, when during slave times, the plantation owners would keep the muscle meat of the hog for themselves, and they would give all the undesirable parts to the slaves, which were technically, that were like the intestines. And so you see a lot of dishes were created from this, but now we realize, like, actually those plantation owners were giving them the most nutritious parts. So
That is really interesting. Okay, so for someone who's not super familiar with organs, I'm sure at this point in the discussion, they're still a little turned off. Like they just don't sound that great. So why should they eat them at all?
yeah, well, if you look at it, we're really skewed these days in America. There's a great book called Eat Like a Human by Dr. Bill Schindler, and he's an archaeologist, or I guess an anthropologist, but an archaeologist. He studies humans and how they eat. And he kind of talks about how, you know, like, and I'm going to mess up the time frame, but let's just say it's like 3 million years ago. We were scavengers. So we were, before that, we were foragers, and then we became scavengers. And when you're a scavenger, you're really only able to grab from the carcass whatever the predator has not eaten. And usually what the predator had not eaten was like some, you know, muscle meat here and there. But as scavengers, we got a little bit of meat then, but not much changed, even though we had that meat protein. But what did change, and they can track this, is it took another 500,000 years or something like that. It was like basically like 2 million years ago, we then became the predator. So we got a tool that could actually take down the animal. And what we got that we had never really gotten before was blood, fat, and organs. Those three things. And so that, and from there, as humans, we exploded, right? We happened to also get fire around that time. We were able to start talking, you know, we developed at an exponential speed once we got blood, fat, and organs. So for my money, when I learned that we couldn't even be having this conversation with each other right now unless our species had gotten blood, fat, and organs, that tells me that they're pretty darn important. But for some reason, we are now just skewed towards muscle meat. And it's, I mean, you go any tribe around the world, you look at any other species in the world, it's any non-human species, the first thing that predator eats when they take it down, the fat, the organs, and the blood. So they know instinctively that's the most nutritious part of the animal. And that's what they go for. And we are severely lacking that. It's something like 93%. And this is an old figure, so I would guess that it's actually higher now. It's probably closer to 95%, but 93% of Americans are nutrient deficient, but we're not calorie deficient. And that's a very important distinction. You know, this isn't like those Ethiopian commercials Sally Struthers used to, you know, be on back in the day, and she'd be talking about like, please donate because these people are not eating food. Like, we're getting food, we're eating too much food, we're an obese nation, but we're eating the wrong foods. Now, yes, you could say, well, that's because it's ultra processed, but I would argue too that it's like we really need to be looking at whole animal health, not just muscle meat. And in many ways, when you look at whole animal health, it solves many things. But one of them that I'm particularly very passionate about that it solves is this idea that you have to be wealthy to be healthy. Because if you think about it, like if you're eating only muscle meat, you know this, it's expensive. It's damn expensive. And most people make $35,000 a year. That's the average. And there is no way they can eat as much muscle meat as the people that make more than that a year do. And that alone, when you eat the whole animal, gets solved, because you could have the same grass-fed cow, okay, same 100% grass-fed cow that, you know, ribeye costs $25 a pound. That same cow has a tongue, has has organs, and those organs and that tongue are being sold for $6 a pound, $4 a pound. You know what I'm saying? Like it's the same quality animal, but just because it's a different cut, now it's way more affordable. So when you're eating whole animal, you really do, you save money, and it makes that health more affordable.
Yeah, that's a great tip, because that's definitely one of the biggest questions I get is how can you afford to be on a carnivore diet? And that's definitely one of my answers. Now, you mentioned in other countries and in tribes and in some locations in the US, people still eat some of these organs fairly commonly, but generally, not only are 95% or so of people nutrient deficient, but we're not eating organs, at least here in the States. But that used to not be the case. So what's changed that's kind of taken it out of favor?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I mean, there's a few reasons. There's a couple of things that happen. One was way back before the 1900s, when we started getting trains, and we had to we were able to transport meat basically across the US. You had a couple things that happened. Is you had the ability to get centralized where you know, butchers and where the slaughterhouses were, and a lot of them were like in the Midwest, you know, even in Detroit area and all that stuff. And so you were restricted though by how cold you could keep that meat, and that's how far you could get it. So it was all restricted around refrigeration. And what they, organ meats need to be kept colder than muscle meat does. And so one of the things was when that happened, they stopped butchers stopped carrying organs as much because they couldn't ship them across because they just didn't have the technology then. But that's not the full reason why we're not into organs. That's the beginning of it, where something that was a staple at the time started to become less and less available because of this now new industrialization of how we ship things, or how we, railroad things. And then you get into like an area of our history around World War II, where you had all these soldiers going across the pond, right? They're basically going to Europe. And there was a big fear of muscle meat or animal protein shortage, big fear around it. And up until that point, organ meats were sort of being eaten, but they weren't being eaten as much because they were seen as kind of a poor person's food. And so as you got more money, more income, you didn't want to purchase those cuts because it was, it wasn't the status symbol that you wanted to extend out. And so that doubled though during World War II, because because of that protein shortage, the US made a point of like doing campaigns around organ meats to try to get people to eat them, and it worked. And that's why most of our grandparents and parents ate organs. A lot of them were forced to eat it, but still a lot of them ate it because their campaigns to get people to eat them worked. But then what happened is you had these soldiers coming back. While they were gone, the women started working. They didn't want to stop working. And so now you had two people in the household working. And so you had more income coming into a household after World War II. And it was like, what are you going to say? Are you going to buy the roast beef, or are you going to buy the liver? And people wanted to buy the more expensive cuts. And so slowly as we progress past our grandparents' age, into the 60s, into the 70s, as people are not eating these cuts, then butchers are not going to carry them. And as butchers don't carry them, they're not in front of us. We don't see them. And then when we don't see stuff, we don't think of buying it, right? And then eventually you start to get to this place of like, oh, now we don't know how to cook them anymore. We've lost the art of cooking them because they're so unfamiliar to us, right? So it's just kind of like steamrolls to this place of like where we are now, which is it's very hard to find them in your local market. When you do, it's a bit overwhelming to people because it's a different texture than muscle meat. It looks differently. It's, if you're looking at the liver, or it's a different color, a different texture. It's slimy to some people. The taste is different. Like we're just we're out of tune with the whole animal at this point. And I genuinely think that that's where we're at. It's like it's not that there's something wrong with them. It's more the opposite. There's something wrong with the system and us, that we've just fallen out of that step. That said, though, in the last 2 years, they have been increasing in popularity. Like I've talked to a lot of farmers who are telling me, yeah, I sell out of my livers now, so people are getting more and more dialed into how important they are. But I always say is like, well, don't just focus on the liver, because I talk to tons of people around organ meats and they're all like, oh yeah, I eat liver once a month or once a week or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but if we were a tribe, okay, and let's just say there's 35 of us in this tribe, and we killed one animal, does that animal have 35 livers? You know what I mean? They have one liver. Do they have 35 hearts? No, they have one heart. So in amongst 35 people in a tribe, we're getting like maybe a little bit of those organs. We're getting hopefully a lot of the blood. We're getting a lot of the fat, but we're only getting a little bit of those organs. And most likely those organs in that tribe are going to the people that really need it, like the pregnant, the sick, anyone that's kind of truly needing a boost of nutrients. So I kind of would argue with someone of like, well, should you be eating liver every week? Like I really think that if anything, we need to, yes, incorporate them in our diet, but we also have to be mindful of like, what is our body telling us we need right now? And the only way to truly get in touch with what your body needs and wants is to eat it versus swallowing it. So this whole like movement of doing capsules, I'm so against that, because it completely bypasses our God-given natural digestive process. And it basically starts making us guess at what we need, because, and I love using this as an example, like salt, for example. If I put salt in your tongue your body tells you immediately, more or less, immediately. There's no hesitation. And maybe after 2 dips into it, your body will be like, oh no, this is gross, too much salt, right? But if I give you a salt tablet, you swallow that, 20, 30 minutes later, you're like, why do I feel bloated? Oh, I got too much salt, right? So one is working with your body, and the other is completely it's just guesswork.
That's a really good point. And I was going to ask you about that because um, this is a good time to kind of transition into talking about Pluck a little bit. It is like a dried organ blend that you sprinkle on your food. And so I was just curious what you thought was the difference between that and taking it as a capsule, but that makes perfect sense. So let's tell everyone what Pluck is and why they might like to try it.
Yeah. So Pluck is basically taking the ingredients that you would find in the capsules, but it's making it a food. So it's taking something technically that was a food. So they were organ meats. And when you freeze dry them, you take raw organ meats, you freeze dry them, and then you powder them, right? So it's all real whole food based. But what supplement companies are doing, they're encapsulating them. And so what I did was I took that same ingredient and I combined it with organic spices and herbs, and I created a shelf stable seasoning that you can put on anything. It's incredibly versatile. And we have 4 products. So 3 of them have different seasonings and spices. And then one of them, which I know is the one that you gravitate towards as a carnivore eater, is just the organ meat. So there's no salt, there's no spices, no herbs, and it's just organ meats. And so you can kind of use any of them and just sprinkle them on. And what happens is you're getting micro dosing frequently because we season all of our food, right? Every meal we eat, we season. And there's no new habit with that. So that's one of the reasons I love Pluck as well, because when you're, I talk to, as I mentioned, I talk to a lot of people in the field, and even those that know that they should be eating organ meats, you ask them, so how long have those organ meats been in your freezer? And they will all say like, oh yeah, a year or 2, like we all have great intentions, like of cooking that, that organ or that tongue or whatever it is, but most of us don't do it. And I can provide tips on how to get you to ease into those, which hopefully we can cover later. But the point is that we just don't do it. And so I really wanted to focus on like, how do I get you to eat these? Like, organ meats are the most nutrient dense food on this planet, but we're not eating them because of those 3 hurdles. And we've kind of touched on one, which is the ick. People think they're icky. We touched on the sourcing of it. Like some people are struggling to find sourcing. Pluck has liver, heart, kidney, spleen, and pancreas. You might be easily finding liver, but are you eating, kidney, spleen, and pancreas and heart? You know what I mean? It's like not everyone's eating all 5 of those. So this is a quick and easy way to get all 5 organs into your diet. You don't need to worry about sourcing because we're sourcing from 100% grass-fed New Zealand cows. You don't need to worry about taste because we've made it taste good. Like you can literally stick your finger in the spice blend and it tastes really good. It's got a really unique umami taste from the organ meats, and it's just got this unique, bold flavor. And then the third thing is you don't need to worry about cooking because you could add this to go food. I mean, you could add this, I always recommend people just have Pluck on their table and they just sprinkle it on after the food has been plated. So there's no kind of learning curve with like, oh, but how do I, because most people, when they do livers, for example, they overcook them. And it makes it more, it just makes it really gross. So most people do not know how to cook organs. And this just removes that step entirely. So there's no more hurdles. And now you're getting those micronutrients and you're getting them every time you eat. And I can't even tell you, like, I didn't know this when I went down this path, but I can't even tell you the amount of people that are telling me that just by using Pluck, that's the only health change they make. I get feedback that their kids now are eating more adventurously, like it's changing their kids' palates. I get told that this one father told me that their child has some kind of chronic illness and that she's already showing signs of improvement just from eating Pluck. It's like I've heard kids like energy changes for people, like they have more energy, they sleep better because they're getting the nutrients they need, during the day, and so then they're sleeping better. I mean, the amount of people that I've been told that this has changed their life has blown me away. I'm so humbled by all of it because I didn't know I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. I just knew that I need to help people get organ meats into their diet. That's all I knew.
I love that. You knew you needed to get them more nutrition, but you didn't know it was going to just completely change lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
So
read a little something on your website that was sort of led you down this path, something with your own daughter. Would you be willing to share that story?
yeah, absolutely. It, it, it was definitely a catalyst for me to come up with Pluck, but I didn't like, I wish I had, let's just put it this way. When this happened to my family, I wish I had Pluck to support them. But basically, my daughters, both of them, we had gone to Canada on this trip. They were both pretty young. One was like maybe 5, the other was maybe like 1.5 or 2 or something like that. And they got Shiga toxin, which is a form of E. coli. So they got it from some food that we must have eaten, I think. When you get Shiga toxin, it's a form of E. coli, but when you get it, you can't hold anything in. Like, so you can't, like, you throw up or you have diarrhea, like nothing stays in. So basically you really can't eat much or drink much. And for my, it's actually it's fatal for young kids and for the elderly. And my oldest, it passed through her. You also can't give a kid antibiotics. Like, it will actually make it worse if you do. So it's one of those things of like, we were really fortunate that we identified what it was before we went to the doctor, because they probably would have defaulted to giving them antibiotics and they could have actually killed them if they had. So we were really fortunate that we knew, we discovered what it was. My oldest kind of got through it pretty quickly. Within like 3 or 4 days, she was already able to eat things and like she was on the upside. But my youngest, who was already really thin, it just wouldn't stop. Like, she could not keep anything in, and it just kept going on, and it lasted like close to 10 days or more. It was like right around there. And I just remember we were like 4 or 5 days in, and I had to go away on this work trip, and I came back. I left thinking she was on the upswing, and I came back and she wasn't, and she was still in it. She couldn't keep anything in. And I came back to a child who was, no joke, she was skin and bones, like completely emaciated looking. And it was so scary. And I just remember thinking, gosh, I wish I had something that could get her those nutrients, but would make it so that it was not something solid that she had eat, like that it was something I could sprinkle on, or something. Because at one point, she even started, like, when she finally was able to keep something down, it was like toast. And then we were like, this is like the worst thing. Like, what? Like, well, I don't want her to be eating toast. But and if anyone knows about like cats, that what happens in kids and cats when they discover there's something that makes them throw up, they then avoid that thing. So now she was like, oh, well, I can eat toast. I know that. So then she became almost like a toast addict, because that was like the food that she knew she could eat, and it would be held down. So I was just like, oh my God, like, this is like one of the worst foods to be giving her right now. And that's where I was like, oh my gosh, if I could have just sprinkled Pluck on that toast, which is how they are to this day. Now they put it on everything. I mean, fortunately, my daughter got through it. She was okay, and she's thriving. But they now use Pluck the way I wish I could have used it in that moment. So they sprinkle it on literally everything. And what's kind of cool is that even when it's foods that some people would say kids don't want to eat, which obviously, I mean, I'm talking to a carnivore, so you would argue, well, this is probably why they don't want to eat it, which is a legit argument, which is like broccoli, for example. Like, parents are always saying, like, eat your broccoli, right? Well, we usually do have some vegetables, and a lot of times it's cultured vegetables, which are a lot better for digestion if you do eat vegetables. And we did have some broccoli that night, and she was like not wanting to eat it. And I was like, well, you're always taking the cultured vegetables. What if I put Pluck on I already put tons of butter on the broccoli and stuff, but I was like, what if I add Pluck to it? And she was like, okay, I'll eat the broccoli. So I was like, oh, this is like the first time probably in the history of the world where a kid is eating something they don't want to eat because you put organ meats on it. Right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
I
Way to
mean,
win.
what a win. Like, just so crazy. But that's how much they like. we truly use it on everything. Like they love it. I've never met a kid that doesn't, to be honest with you. I think kids are more in touch with what they need than even adults. And I've never met a kid who tastes it, who's like, ew, like they all love it. And if anything, they get a little aggressive around it. Like parents tell me like, oh yeah, when we run out of Pluck, my kid starts crying, like I don't know. I mean, I think it's a sign that, kids know what they need. This is a really interesting quote. This is actually from Dr. Bill Schindler as well, but it's like, we are the only species in the world that looks to someone else to tell us what to eat.
Mm.
And that to me just says everything. And so I believe kids though are still at that age where they are more in touch with what their body needs than we are, as long as they're not already influenced or addicted to these ultra processed foods. They tend to know exactly what their body needs. And I'm really more and more trying to encourage adults to re-tap into that innate knowledge that we have. I mean, the problem is we're being manipulated, like the ultra processed foods are manipulating them. The marketing around them is manipulating. It's challenging. You got to kind of declutter, all the marketing and all these extreme flavors and that have no nutrition. You really have to kind of get back to basics. And I'm always telling people, like, one of the ways you could do that is when you go to the grocery store, buy things that are ingredients versus that have ingredients. That's one thing.
Yeah.
Obviously when you look at the back of a package, like instead of just buying the thing because it looks delicious, because of course the outside, the front label is really a billboard, right? They're just trying to pull you in. It's the back that is slightly more regulated. And when you turn it around and you look at the ingredients, if there are ingredients that you don't recognize, that you don't even understand, you're like disodium, you're like, what is that? Like, if you don't understand what it is, most likely your body's not going to either.
100%. Now, I'm really excited about this kid thing because I don't have children, but I'm hosting my nieces next week. They're 6 and 11. And I have my own Pluck that I sprinkle on my food. Like you said, I just do the pure one. It doesn't have any actual seasoning in it. But I'm gonna try this. When they want pizza or whatever thing that I normally wouldn't have, I'm gonna make it a superfood. And they're not
Totally.
gonna know. And I cannot wait to see how that goes.
Yeah, add some to the sauce or something like that, and they won't know. Yeah, I that's super exciting. And if anything, you'll probably get a comment like, "This is so good. This pizza was so good. Thank you, Aunt Jen. What did you do? Whatever." You'll
I'm
become
gonna
like
have
the
Go
guru.
ahead.
They'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I want to go back to Aunt Jen's house, whatever, to try her food. It was so good."
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to set up a secret camera so I can get all the reactions and stuff because they'll
Oh,
just
that'd be
pick
cool.
that up if I'm filming the whole time.
Yeah, yeah, that would be fun.
I will report back on that. But so I was just mentioning I have the plain one with no extra seasoning, but what other flavors do you have?
The other ones, so we use Redmond real salt, which I know I think you probably use Redmond a little bit, but Redmond is a favored salt among definitely carnivore community and many others. But we use Redmond real salt, and then the other blends, one is called all purpose, which is got smoked paprika in it and some lemon peel and some thyme and parsley, and then there's spicy, which is got cayenne in it in addition. And then there's one called zesty garlic, which has no nightshades or seeds. So there's no peppers, no tomatoes, no eggplant, nothing like that. And and then no seeds. And that one's primarily herbs, garlic, onion, and it also has a little bit of carrot in there. And all of them, though, what's kind of unique about them, when you look at seasonings or even just any packaged foods, one of the things, like if you even look at our palates, this is kind of a conversation of what's in food and then also what our palates skew towards as Americans. So there's the four tastes that we're very aware of, like there's salty, sweet, bitter, and sour. And then there's a fifth called umami that was discovered in like the late 80s, early 90s. And they're all unique flavors. But I would say that we really skew in the US towards salty and sweet. And one of the reasons why we skew towards salty and sweet is because these packaged food companies, and really even at restaurants, this is the case, for different reasons, and I'll cover it. But like, so basically when you do a packaged food, you really have to maintain your margins. Every business that's selling food is trying to make a profit. And so one of the ways to make that profit, whether you're a restaurant or you're a packaged food supplier, is to use cheap ingredients, because the cheaper the ingredients means the more you make from that product. And there's really two main ingredients that are incredibly cheap, and that's salt and sugar. And when you can pump your product full of those, that means you have a better margin. So for example, even with spices, you'll find if you pair our all-purpose seasoning with, let's say, Lowry's salt, you'll find that ours will have more flavor and it will have less salt. So it won't taste as salty. And it's because they're pumping theirs full with more salt, more sodium, because it's a cheap ingredient. And that goes for every spice blend. You'll see that usually the number one ingredient is salt on most of those things. And then you'll start to read the back of these other packaging, you'll start to see that sugar, some variation of sugar. It might be high fructose corn syrup, it might be dextrose. There's some kind of like variation of sugar in the product. And then of course there's some kind of sodium. And then restaurants do the same thing, but they do it for a different reason. I mean, yes, they're trying to get good margins as well, but the way a restaurant does it is, so when you are making a recipe, in the kitchen, you have kind of a hierarchy. So the chef is paid the most, and then you have people that are line cooks that are paid a lot less. And at most restaurants, from, you know, Greasy Spoons on up, the majority of the people in that kitchen are the low paid people. And those people are not trained the way a chef is. So a chef will be trained to, like, if a sauce or a dressing gets too bitter, they know how to get out of it. They know how to fine tune a recipe to make it better. And they know how to do that with the ingredients provided. The line cook, or the person that's really just kind of following the recipe, who doesn't understand, you know, the kind of chemistry of the ingredients like the way a chef does, that person is really, they don't know how to get out of these holes. And so what they're taught is, okay, if it goes bitter, you add sugar. If it goes, you know, they basically know to add either more salt or more sugar. And if you ever got too bitter or sour, you add more sugar. And if it's ever too salty, you add a little bit more vinegar. Like they're taught like a couple of really basic moves, but the two main moves is to either add more salt or add more sugar. So you just find that even in restaurants, things are incredibly salty and they're incredibly sweet.
That makes sense. Let's circle back a little bit to some of the whole food organ stuff, which the Pluck is awesome for daily use. I'm just kind of starting to get into trying some organ stuff, and partly because I knew we had this interview coming up, but also I've been experimenting with it a little more lately. And so to talk about the price, I can definitely attest to what you said. I recently got a beef tongue and it was $6 a pound. And I got some liver for $4 a pound. And I don't remember the price of everything, but I also got some oxtail, some chicken livers, chicken hearts. I mean, I have a freezer full of organs now, and I'm excited to try some of those. But where I found them, I know you mentioned the ethnic markets. I didn't even think of that. So that's a great idea. I'll have to check that out. But I did find several things from a local farmer, and then most everything actually at a local butcher. So I think it's just a matter maybe of asking around a little bit in your area. You might strike out and then you try someplace else. And one other thing I wanted to mention, for my whole year and a half as a carnivore, I've been getting fat trimmings from the meat cutters at my grocery store for free. And so I try to share this knowledge as much as I can, because it's like the best bang for your buck. I can add it to meat and make it stretch further, and it's delicious. And but I never thought of fat as an organ. Would you consider that in that sort of definition?
Yeah, it's the fat. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's actually part of the organ. I wouldn't say it's an organ. I think it's fat. Fat is fat. But I more referenced the fat when I was talking about the nutritional difference between just eating meat and versus getting the blood, the fat, and the organs. That the fat is incredibly nutritious is more of the point, just like the organs are, and just like the blood is. And in many ways, they are more nutritious than the meat. Like, I think one of the things that makes the meat as nutritious as it is the blending of the fat.
Yes. And kind of to reiterate this point, if you're supplementing your muscle meat diet with organs and fat, you're going to stretch your dollar way further
You
and
really
make it more
are.
nutritious and likely more delicious, at least with the fat.
Totally, because that's one of the biggest complaints about carnivore diet is it's very like bland, right? You're kind of like, if you're only eating one cut of muscle meat and you're only adding salt, that is your flavor profile. Like that's it. It doesn't diverge from there. You know what I'm saying? If you're not mixing up the fats, if you're not changing the cut, if you're not doing any of those variations, then you are flatlining your taste buds. And for a lot of people, cooking, like, some people, food is fuel, right? There's nothing about it. It's just like, I eat and I feel myself and I move on. Like for most people, that is the case. And kudos to them. That's great. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but for many of us, it's that variation of texture, um, like, so in internal texture and external texture. So you have the crispiness on the outside, softness, you have textures almost like smooth things versus hard. So there's that texture, and that flavor is really what kind of inspires us to eat a lot of times, if you think about it. That's why I think so many people are addicted to like crunchy things, or to salty things. It's because there's certain flavors and textures that feed certain emotional parts of us, certain innate kind of like qualities, in terms of like I find a lot of women typically lean towards more creamier things, like more cheeses and more creamers. Now I know that's not just gender, because of course there's plenty of men that do it as well, but it's interesting that's one of the first things I always ask someone when I work with them as a private chef, is I say, well, what kind of textures did you grow up eating? What kind of flavors do you find when you're having a hard day that you gravitate towards? Like, those are questions that you can ask yourself. And once you have that answer, then you can apply that to your everyday food to kind of make it more enjoyable, make it more interesting for you.
Yeah, and then back to the Pluck thing, if you're using one with the flavored seasoning, I mean, that's going to completely change the flavor too. I've shared with you personally that I've struggled with experimenting with seasonings because I feel like I'm a little bit of a poster child for pure carnivore, salt, meat, water only. And so I feel a little bit of pressure, but I'm just starting to get to this place where I'm like, you know what? I don't care so much about being carnivore as much as I care about being healthy. And so I've tried adding a few little things back in, and nothing is stuck enough to share yet, but I will continue to share that journey as it goes. But this adding kind of seasonings, I think, is one place that I want to try to experiment, just to add more flavors and to make my meals a little bit more well-rounded for guests. I cook for guests a lot and they usually like what I cook, but I'm sure they're like, yeah, I'm good on the meat and salt. Like I had it twice this week where I can have it every day. But if
Right.
I can change up the flavor profile a little bit, I think that will help. So stay tuned for that, everybody.
Yeah, I'll
Is
be
there,
curious to hear that.
in general, any tips or tricks for cooking organs?
Yeah, well, just going off of the list of some of the things you have, like, I think it's really great that you got the hearts. You said you got chicken hearts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so chicken hearts I would advise that those are probably the first organ. If you're new to organs, I would start with chicken hearts. Um, they are incredibly mild. They're small, so you can just chop them up and make it not look like a heart. So you're not having to deal with like a crazy texture or an unfamiliar texture, or even just something that looks a certain way that maybe uninspires you. Because some people, when they see like the tongue, for example, they don't get inspired to eat it because they just see a tongue, an animal tongue. But of course they're missing out, that's because it's so delicious. And I'll even share a little bit about that, but I would start with chicken hearts. And then from there, I always recommend, when you're working with an organ, is really focus on remove the part that is hindering you from enjoying it. So for most people, that is the visual. So try to remove, like if it's a liver, for example, try to put it in a different shape than what is the one that's overwhelming you. So like how I recommend people do livers, or even really most organs, like that, like even kidney, is instead of when you get them, that you get them frozen, right? So in its frozen state, that's when it's not very overwhelming. Like if it's frozen, it's not overwhelming at all. It's when it's defrosted that it gets overwhelming, because then you're like, oh, it's slimy, it's really big. Like, what do I do with all this liver? There's no way I'm going to do one dish and come, we'll eat all, you utilize this entire liver, and then I'm stuck with more liver the next days, and I'm probably not even going to want it the next days, because I'm going to be all maxed out with all my vitamins and minerals. And so what I recommend is just keep it frozen, because in its frozen state, it's not overwhelming. What you can do is just grate it, and now it doesn't even look like a liver. It's just little like gratings that you can mix into your ground meats. You can even add it to a sauce if you're doing any sauces. Like if you were doing your spaghetti or pizza sauce for the kids that will be coming, like I would even grate some in there. You could even chop up the hearts really small and cook them into the sauce as well. And the kids will probably think they're mushrooms if they like mushrooms, things like that. So anything that kind of messes with that texture and the look, definitely. I would also recommend doing things in ways that continue that idea of like where your brain doesn't associate it. So like some people, what they do is they cut like a little chunk of that liver, like not too big, like an ice cube chunk of liver. They keep it frozen, and then they throw it in smoothies, for example, when they make smoothies, things like that. But as a carnivore, you're not going to be able to do that kind of stuff. So what I would recommend then is just to really focus on ratios as a carnivore. So you can always still do the actual muscle meat. So let's just say you're making, I don't know, like what's an example of something you typically make?
Ground beef burger patties.
Okay, perfect. So I would take that and I would first grate some of the liver in there. You could also chop up some of the hearts, the chicken hearts, and put those in. But the keys when you're doing it, you can even use, as we already talked about, the Pluck Pure. But the key when you're doing it is to keep the ratio down. So the muscle meat will be the largest amount, and then the organs will be smaller. And I usually recommend, like if you have a pound of meat, that you're maybe keeping the organ meats to about 1/4 of a cup or less, something around there. And then it won't affect the texture and it won't affect the taste too much. If you go beyond that, then you're starting to enter whole new realms of like, oh, it's tastes different. If it's ground up, it will affect the texture, and it will actually, I don't know, I find that it won't be as meaty, like it won't have a bite to it. It will actually be kind of almost more like hamburger helper style stuff, like where it's almost like smoother, if that makes sense. So it does change the texture. When you get to tongue, that's another thing with tongue. So tongue is only overwhelming because of that hard, thick skin that's on the outside of it. Underneath that, once you boil it for about 1.5 hours, that skin completely peels off. And underneath that, you have this really amazing, delicious muscle meat. It's really basically a muscle meat. So it's going to be really close to what you're used to with muscle. It's more nutritious. It's got even more nutrients. It's got a little bit more flavor, but it's actually a really good flavor. But what's cool about it is you can also still combine it with other meats. So like, I don't know if you're making like carnivore tacos or something like that. You could, or even a stew, you could chop up the tongue and still combine it with that ground meat or pork or whatever it is you're eating, muscle wise, and just marry the two. And in that case, you can do 50-50 if you want. It doesn't really matter. As long as they're combined, you're not going to get a predominant tongue taste or a predominant organ taste. You just won't.
I have to brag a little to say that I made tongue because I knew we were having this meeting and I wanted to try it. So to your point, it's delicious. It was weird at first because the thick skin on the tongue, and I mean, it's got taste buds and it looks
little hair
really
kind of
weird.
things.
Yeah, like little villi or something.
Yeah.
But I just threw it in the Instant Pot with a little bit of water and some salt. And then that skin just peels right off. It's like taking off a sock, which is weird still. But once that's off, it's just a hunk of meat. And I just shredded it with forks, and it was like shredded beef or pulled pork. and so delicious.
Did you stick it under the broiler after just to get it a little crispy?
I didn't. I should
Oh,
have
okay,
talked to
you
you
could do that.
first.
You could do that just to, just to add, change the texture. But that's beautiful. And that is, yeah, you see how good it is. And once that's what's kind of cool. This is true with Pluck as well, is once you get these flavors, it's kind of hard. Like muscle meat's going to taste different now. Like it's just not going to be as flavorful as tongue is. Tongue is so flavorful.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I mean, I find that's true. Like even with kids, when they put Pluck on things, like they're like, yeah, like my kids will have popcorn, for example, they'll put it on Pluck and it's like, or they'll put Pluck on the popcorn and they'll tell me like, yeah, I can't eat popcorn without it now because it's just, it tastes so plain. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. It's like these organ meats have more nutrition, but the nutrition is also more flavor. They go
Mm.
hand in hand. More, when something has a really nice, strong flavor, it's usually because it's more nutritious.
Yeah, that's what a great find, and something for you to produce. I'm so glad you did.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, I I know that even though Pluck is focusing on offal and organ meat, but I really ultimately my goal is just to get people to eat more whole animal. And so I have other products that are coming down the road that are going to be incorporate even more other parts of the animal. And I just hope that one day soon we'll have a line of products that are just making this concept of eating whole animal that we discussed earlier in this talk as easy and delicious for people as possible. Because I know that if it's easy and delicious, you'll do it. And that's the thing that I've been in this business a long time, as we talked about, as a chef in the health field. And I have noticed that trends come and go. We constantly are like, there's the new hot health trend is happening, right? And we're all kind of invested in that thing. But in my nearly 20 years of doing this, I haven't really found one trend that stayed the entire 20 years, except for eating whole food, eating real food. Like that's the one that I don't think that's going to be something that goes away. You know what I mean? Like that is the one that is, to me, always the default. You always come back to. But the biggest thing I've noticed is that people as humans were inconsistent. So my job and what my kind of mission is, I'm trying to create consistency around our health. And I know that if I make it easy, if I first of all tap those really nutrient dense foods, those animal products that are nutrient dense, and I make them easy and delicious, then as humans, now we can find consistency, because easy and delicious creates consistency. It's when something is only one of those, it's delicious, but it's hard, then it's not going to be consistent. Or it's easy, but it doesn't taste good. That's not going to be consistent. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So that is truly my mission now. I really want to make sure, I don't want to just create another product that's snake oil. Like I really want to help people get healthier, because I truly believe if I can help you feel better in your body, then you're going to treat other people better, because we treat people how we feel. And if you're treating other people better, then now we have a different world.
Wow, suddenly this went from, just a little seasoning to really enhancing human life, and I appreciate that. Now I have to point out, it's really dark all of a sudden. I'm right in front of a window. It's always bright and beautiful lighting, but there's like a terrible thunderstorm apparently. There's lightning and thunder. The sirens are going off. I
Oh
hope
my
you can't
gosh.
hear them. I'm sure I'm fine, but that's why it's so dark.
I noticed you went kind of grayscale. I was like, oh, you look great. But I'm like, this is kind of moody.
Yeah, so for the viewer, I'm really sorry about that. I had no intentions of having to set up lighting. I guess I should have. Anyway, as long as you can still see me. But James, I know we're running close on time. You've got stuff to do today. So I just want to know if people are interested in Pluck, and or they want to go get some recipes to how to make some whole food offal themselves, where can they go to find that?
Yes. So eatpluck.com is the website. And on that website, you'll see a recipes tab. And we have tons of recipes from some really great chefs. I mean, one of them is like a Michelin star chef, and he shares a chicken hearts recipe. I think it's either chicken hearts or chicken livers, or yeah, one of the two. But delicious recipe. There's tongue taco recipe. Yeah, so there's just wonderful recipes on that site. Highly recommend. We get amazing feedback from people that tell us that every recipe they've tried is spectacular. So that always makes me feel good. And then I think you'll probably share in the show notes that they get a discount from you to buy Pluck, right?
Yeah, so I'll definitely put that in the caption. I have a code you can use to get 10% off.
Yeah. So eatpluck.com, use Jennifer's code and give it a try, and hopefully you'll agree and see how not only delicious it is, but how easy it makes getting this whole animal nutrition into your diet.
Yes. Now I'm going to try, like I said, some of those other seasonings soon and report back. But also, I've just felt really inspired by this. So, what I want to try to do for the next couple of months is make a new organ once a week. So, I did
Yeah.
beef tongue so far. I'm going to do oxtail, chicken livers, chicken hearts, whatever else I have. I have more stuff and I'm going to continue getting things. So, I'll make videos about those as I do. And I would love for you guys to join me if that interests you. We can just kind of try different things and report back how it's going and share tips and tricks and maybe even bug James if we have questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And make sure to share how you feel when you're doing it. And I think like part of the conversation has to be like when you're making it, like, yes, you're going to have some kind of like mental hurdles to get over because we're not very conditioned towards eating organ meats anymore. But I'll be really curious to hear, like, once you finally taste it, does your body tell you, oh, I want more? Like, this is really good. Like, I know, like, for example, when my wife eats chicken hearts, which she loves, like, she gets one in her mouth. She can't stop. Like, her body just goes like more and more and more, you know? So I'll be really curious to hear how you respond innately to these foods as they go, get into your mouth.
I will let you know. I'm suddenly very excited about chicken hearts.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for spreading the word.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here, James. And for those of you watching, thank you for watching until the end. If you've stayed here this long, you are my people. If you guys like this, please like and subscribe and catch me on Instagram where we can connect every day.